Today I will continue by outlining a few further things relating to our recent reflections. Understanding the present day, with all its divergent currents of spiritual and materialistic views, is extremely difficult, and one ought not to think that this confused picture of modern times can be understood without having the will to perceive how these times have long been in preparation as history slowly unfolded. Today, drawing on our spiritual scientific insights, we will look back to what we call the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. As you know, this epoch began around the year 747 BC and ended as the 15th century began, in around 1413. The dates themselves must, of course, be regarded, like all such figures, as an approximation. In this period, we find at work certain powers that have an inner consistency and mutual relationship, and differ essentially from all the powers prevailing both before and after this epoch. This time, during which the rational or mind soul developed in human nature, can be further subdivided into three smaller eras. The period starting around 747 BC, the date, in fact, when Rome was actually founded, and ended about 27 BC. The second period extends from this date, 27 BC, to roughly the end of the 7th century AD, that is, to the year 693. And the last and shorter period lasts from 693 to around 1413. Since that time, around 1413, we have been in a new phase of soul development, with distinctive qualities with which we are already familiar. We can make a clear distinction in terms of human soul evolution between the fourth post-Atlantean epoch and the three preceding epochs of ancient India, ancient Persia, and Egypt Chaldea, and likewise between this fourth epoch and the fifth that follows it. In the same way, we can also clearly distinguish characteristic stages within this fourth epoch itself, which are significant for the development of civilization. In each of these shorter phases, we can observe how humanity progresses in particular ways. Taking the first of these phases, 747 to 27 BC, footnote, Steiner actually says 27 years before the mystery of Golgotha, and it is therefore not clear if he means 27 BC or 6 AD. End of footnote. We will naturally think first and foremost of the peoples living around the Mediterranean, in whom we find developing a very particular state of soul. History tells us little about this since its ideas and concepts avoid engaging with really characteristic qualities. If we wish to properly characterize this period and the inner factors of humanity's evolution at work then, we can say that during it, human souls slowly detach themselves from a connection with the whole spiritual cosmos. If we look back to Egyptian and Chaldean times, the epoch of the sentient soul, human beings felt that their soul belonged to the cosmos. The sentient soul in human nature sensed that the human being is a part of the universe. We cannot properly describe Egyptian and Chaldean evolution without taking account of the fact that people in those times, in observing the cosmos around them, received through their senses and feelings something that came to expression in this awareness of harmony with the spiritual cosmos, of being part of it. Just as we can say that the fingers of our hands are and feel one with us, so people in ancient Egypt and Chaldea felt themselves one with the spiritual cosmos. This feeling for the cosmos underwent a crisis in the 8th century BC, was shaken to its roots. In the past, human souls owed their sense of belonging with the cosmos to their ancient atavistic and dreamy clairvoyance. In those days, people did not perceive as we do today. In their sense perceptions, they also perceived the spirit, the divine, a faculty which modern scholars, in their ignorance, call animism. In this way, people of those times felt intimately connected with the spirit of the cosmos. This intimate connection faded, and on the one hand, this led to many symptoms of decadence, while on the other, it led to the wonders of Greek culture. You see, the culture of ancient Greece is founded primarily on the human being's experience of standing in isolation in the universe, no longer as an intrinsic part of the cosmos, but as a complete and self-encompassing human totality. In a sense, the human being had emerged from the cosmos and embarked on an existence that was complete in itself. The beauties and wonders of Greek culture could never have emerged if a more ancient form of soul experience had continued to prevail, such as held sway in ancient India, for instance, along with this sense of close belonging to the cosmos. The glories of Greek culture, which in other regions also surfaced as less delightful phenomena, all developed between the 8th and 1st centuries BC. Humanity withdrew into the realm of soul, into the purely human, approaching the mystery of Golgotha as this period progressed. Let us not forget that the mystery of Golgotha inevitably has a quality that cannot entirely be encompassed by human understanding, nor human supersensible understanding either. Some part of it inevitably evades our comprehension. What was accomplished as Christ entered earthly evolution cannot, as I have explained in various previous reflections, be summed up in human concepts, or encompassed in human feelings. And connected with this is the fact that as this mystery of Golgotha developed, in a sense, civilized humanity was prepared for it in a way that did not allow full awareness or experience of this event to dawn. Instead, it occurred alongside and at one remove from ordinary human experience. In terms of history, this is fairly clear. Civilized humanity around the Mediterranean took little notice of Christ Jesus, nor of what was happening in the far-flung Jewish province of Palestine. This scarcely figures even in Tacitus, writing 100 years after the mystery of Golgotha. On the one hand, therefore, we have advancing civilization, and on the other, at one remove from it, a current in which the mystery of Golgotha occurred. These two streams flow alongside, but separate from each other. This could only happen because as the divine act was accomplished, civilization had shut itself off from the divine, and a life was unfolding which no longer had a direct connection with the spirit. A spiritual event took place upon the globe which human civilization itself ignored. In all former times, it would have been inconceivable for such a division to exist between outward culture and a mystery event, since human culture in those days was fully informed by an awareness of divine spiritual realities. It is very characteristic, highly significant, that the mundane culture running parallel to the mystery of Golgotha had closed itself off, and therefore was distanced from this event. In the second period of this epoch, thus beginning around 27 BC and ending in AD 693, the whole of Central European culture is basically founded on preventing any understanding of the mystery of Golgotha from informing mundane civilization. It may seem very strange to you that I say this, since Christianity did indeed spread abroad through the Central European culture of those times, and yet it spread in the way I recently described. The mystery of Golgotha occurred in splendid isolation. Certainly, aspects of it reached mainstream culture in an external and dogmatic fashion. People knew that Christ had come, that he had disciples, brought this or that to humanity, and made this or that remark about the human being's relationship to the divine. This entered mundane culture in the form of outward phrases and principles. And yet alongside these externalities, it was also true that the whole of humanity, really, which absorbed Christianity during these centuries, remained distant from any inner understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. It would have been possible to gain deeper insight into what actually happened at the mystery of Golgotha with the aid of gnosis and certain forms of preparation founded on traditional wisdom passed down from heathen peoples. But this did not happen. Such things were all declared heretical. Instead, trivial formulations were used as a narrow mold into which to pour Christianity, whose deeper aspects, of course, can never be limited and confined in this way. The mystery of Golgotha can be comprehended only through the highest spiritual striving, and the fruits of wisdom this can reveal. The institutions established in the early Christian centuries really did not serve to connect people with the mystery of Golgotha, but instead inculcated something in people's souls that remained very distant from any sense of communion with it. Rather than fostering insight, the Church cultivated non-understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. If you trace the history of the various ecumenical councils and all the ecclesiastical machinations during this period, you will find that all this aimed to inculcate dogmatic ideas in people of a kind that sought to ensure that everything connected with the mystery of Golgotha would be conceived in terms far removed from the life of the human soul. We can sum all this up, albeit somewhat radically, by saying that people tried to equip themselves with certain ideas about the mystery of Golgotha and its effects. And yet what they might find out about this was not the most important thing. Instead, they were intent on cultivating the sense that the mystery of Golgotha did not directly concern them, and that Christ would ensure they were saved. There was a tendency increasingly to push the reality of these sacred spiritual events into another realm altogether, rather than conceiving of them as being connected with what unfolds in the human breast. These two things were to be kept as far as possible sundered. An unconscious aim was at work here, a self-evident and yet not articulated intention. And this only surfaced clearly in the year 869 at the Eighth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople. This goal was to prevent the human spirit from any direct personal preoccupation with spiritual reality, which instead was to be confined to the mystery of Golgotha. In other words, efforts were afoot to quash any personal feeling engagement with the mystery of Golgotha. It was to remain shrouded in incomprehension. By this means, the Church sought gradually to subject people to its authority, allowing them only a mundane understanding of these mysteries, and increasingly cultivating the belief that one cannot reflect upon supersensible things, since they are beyond the scope of an individual human soul. Human reflection was to limit itself to physical reality only, rather than developing powers suitable for seeking an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. In certain resolutions passed by the Eighth Ecumenical Council at Constantinople, we find a clear articulation of efforts to prevent people in Europe from thinking for themselves. since human soul faculties were not to engage with the realm of living reality, to which the mystery of Golgotha belongs. Precisely in this middle period of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, therefore, from around 27 BC to AD 693, a belief was cultivated in humanity that all human knowledge and feeling was fit only for this sensory realm of existence. The non-sensory or supersensible realm, the other side of existence, or whatever one wishes to call it, was withdrawn from direct knowledge and perception, put beyond the scope of human feeling and faculties. Really, we can only understand the history of this whole period if we consider this. Throughout these centuries, all the actions of the Catholic Church aimed to inculcate in people the belief that their soul faculties were fit only for the physical realm, and the supersensible realm could approach them only without the involvement of their own powers of understanding and perception. Because of this, after the end of this middle period, thus around the 8th and 9th century, European humanity was plunged into a kind of darkness as far as the human soul's connection with the supersensible realm was concerned. Bernard of Clairvaux is typical of a phenomenon that can be understood in this context, as someone standing beyond everything physical and sensory, and devoting his soul entirely to all that exceeds the scope of natural human understanding. This fervor for what lies beyond human comprehension must be included in our view of someone like Bernard, with his whole configuration of soul. In this figure particularly, we can find traits of mighty grandeur, since everything that is somewhat shifted or distorted can also have a beautiful, grand, and glorious aspect. But in Bernard, too, we will find characteristics of soul which show clearly that he emerged from the prevailing mood developing in Western culture in these centuries. Besides Bernard of Clairvaux, one might name other figures. He is merely typical of them, for instance, in the way he speaks to his followers of all that will be vouchsafed to them by the crusade he intends to embark on. Then the crusade fails, but how does this fervently devout man speak about the failure? Roughly as follows: if everything ends badly, the verdict on this failure may be meted out to me, but not to God, for the divine can never be wrong. So even when a person knew himself to be closely connected with the divine spiritual power underlying all reality, he makes a careful distinction between this reality and himself, saying that he will bear the blame, but that truth and spiritual reality exist beyond such fault, beyond the current of existence on which the human soul is born. At the beginning of the third era of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, therefore, a kind of darkness had come to shroud humanity. We can see this in the fact that human concepts no longer testify to a connection with real spiritual streams and impulses. If you study philosophy, written in the centuries from the 8th to the 15th, you will find that it continually seeks to prove that spiritual reality cannot be grasped by human ideas and concepts. It was thought that this reality must be, quote, left to revelation, close quote, in the phrase of the time, and to ecclesiastical teachings. Thus the power of the Church developed, emerging not only from theological impulses, but from this doctrine that people must limit their own powers of cognition, their own faculties of soul, to physical and sensory life, and refrain from trying to fathom the supersensible realm with their thinking. The concept of faith arose from this at a later date, and was certainly not present in the early centuries, as you can conclude from historical documents. This idea of faith states that faith rather than knowledge is the only possible human response to the divine. This division between the truth available to faith and that available to knowledge developed from these important historical contexts which underlie what I have been speaking of today. Since the 15th century, roughly since the year 1413, we live, as the third millennium will show, in a period founded on everything that happened under influences such as those I have described. We carry this legacy with us. And yet at the same time, an entirely new quality is also developing in this fifth post-Atlantean epoch. In that fourth epoch, if we survey its whole compass, we see the human soul being sundered from the divine spiritual world, being directed to and becoming dependent upon merely external, physical, and sensory processes. This was a new development at that time, and did not exist, as I have said, in ancient Egyptian and Chaldean epochs. In our age, something new is likewise entering, and humanity's task is increasingly to become more conscious so as to recognize all this, seeing, on the one hand, what has been passed down as legacy from a past epoch, and what, on the other, is emerging as a new development in our own epoch. Let us first consider the legacy passed down to us. As we saw, we have inherited a frame of mind in which we feel convinced that we must develop our soul life quite separately from the supersensible realm. The further legacy of this, as you will see the more carefully you study history, is a clear conviction in which no room for doubt remains that rooting human soul faculties in the sensory domain and shutting them off from the supersensible led to a situation in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. Thus, since the 15th century, in which this whole supersensible realm was dismissed as an illusion. Firstly, efforts were aimed at keeping human beings at a distance from the supersensible, as apparent in the Eighth Ecumenical Council in 869. And then, because the supersensible realm had been kept at arm's length, as the Church saw fit, this realm came to be rejected altogether. A belief developed that human beings themselves had invented it, and that it had no reality. If we really wish to understand the origins of modern materialism, we have to seek them in the Church itself. Naturally, the Church is only the outward expression of deeper powers at work in human evolution, but we acquire insight into this evolution if we examine more carefully how one thing really emerges from another. In the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, right-thinking people believed that human powers of cognition were fit only for comprehending sensory things, while the non-sensory had to be left to revelation, unsullied by human thinking. Holding one's own individual views of the divine was deemed heretical, and would, they thought, lead only to error and delusion. The modern Marxist or social democrat, the true offspring of this view, has actually emerged from the Catholicism of former centuries, and holds that all science worthy of the name can only relate to processes in the physical world of the senses. No such thing as spiritual science can exist, since the spirit is an illusion. The only acknowledged cultural domain that bears any relation to it is social science, the science of social coexistence. This kind of outlook has, of course, assumed diverse forms in different cultural regions of the earth, but this is the general trend of it. From the 9th century onward, therefore, in Central and Western Europe, efforts were focused on cultivating belief in the supersensible without people knowing anything of it, except through revelation, a kind of unknowing faith. The soul qualities of Central European peoples had to be taken into account, could not simply be ignored. It would not have worked to tell people to focus only on food and drink and other pragmatic matters, and ignore things too lofty for them. In Western Europe this would not have worked. This was done, however, in Eastern Europe, and is the cause of the ecclesiastical division between Eastern and Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, people really were confined to a narrow focus on the sensory world. Their powers were to be preoccupied with physical matters and develop in this realm. And what unfolded as the Orthodox Church belonged to the lofty heights of the mysteries, quite untinged by sensory things. Here there was a strict division between what people elaborated out of their human nature and the real world of spirit, which in a rarefied atmosphere floated far above people in the rites of worship. What was the inevitable outcome of this? It was inevitable that in various nuances of feeling, a view formed that only the sensory and physical realm has meaning. One can put it like this: powers of which no use is made, but which instead are locked away inside a person, do not develop, they wither. For centuries, people were prevented from encompassing the supersensible in their mind or spirit, and thus their powers became ever less practiced at doing so, and ultimately vanished altogether. This utter absence is something we now rediscover in modern socialist views. It is not their socialism itself that is so dire, but the wholesome rejection of supersensible spirit, which leads people to confine their scope to the social structures of a mere human animal. The laming of the human being's supersensible powers led eventually to a focus on mere social structures for human animals. This arose because people were forced to cease connecting their soul with a living experience of the stream of life that brings the blessing of knowledge of the mystery of Golgotha's meaning. And what was this connected with? In this fourth post-Atlantean epoch, Luciferic powers were working very strongly to detach the human being from the cosmos. These powers always seek to isolate the human being egotistically, to cut him off from the whole spiritual cosmos, even in his knowledge of the physical cosmos. For this reason, no science existed at the time when this sundering reached its peak. This is Luciferic. And so we must say that the division between sense-based knowledge and supersensible dogmatism is Luciferic in nature. The Ahrimanic opposes the Luciferic here, two adversaries of the human soul. This withering of supersensible human powers, leading to a purely brutish form of socialism, which is now set to have a devastating, destructive impact on humanity, must be ascribed to Luciferic powers. The new element that is developing in our age is different in nature, is more Ahrimanic. The Luciferic seeks to isolate people, cut them off from the supersensible spiritual realm, give them the illusion that they are a totality in themselves. By contrast, the Ahrimanic makes people afraid of the spirit, stops them approaching it, gives them the illusion that the spirit is not something that humankind can attain to. Whereas Luciferic influence works through culture and education to keep human beings away from the supersensible, the Ahrimanic does so through invoking fear of the spirit, a kind of intrinsic bodily fear that has emerged particularly since the 15th century. While Luciferic sundering from the spirit came to expression especially under the mantle of Orthodox Christianity in the East, Ahrimanic sundering through fear was bred largely in the element of Western culture, and quite particularly in American culture. Such truths may feel uncomfortable to many, but they are true nevertheless, and we will make no headway today by talking in general terms, however mystically or theosophically, about our connection with the divine. We have to acknowledge reality. That is the only way to advance. And we can only create order again amidst our chaos by recognizing the distinctive nature of diverse streams that flow alongside each other. Each of these streams has a local origin, determined by particular conditions. But then it spreads and merges in a turbulent muddle with all the others to form what we call culture nowadays. I would call Americanism, as a collective term not to be applied to individual Americans, everything that betrays fear of the spirit, the longing to live only with the physical plane, and at most also with what rises into this physical sensory plane as coarse spirit, spiritualistic emanations and such like, which is not true spirit. Americanism is characterized by fear of the spirit, but this Americanism does not live merely in America itself, where it comes to very pronounced expression in the will character of the social realm, but above all in all science. Since the 15th century, this science has increasingly developed what we might call a, quote, fear of the spirit, close quote. Science is regarded as objective only where it sheds all inwardly engendered living concepts. Observation of nature is meant to remain untinged by any idea or concept engendered in the human soul. Only dead and arid observation is accepted by science, not a living, spirit-imbued quality. To introduce an idea or concept into one's observations in the Hegelian fashion, which is a truly Central European approach, or also in the way that Schelling or Goethe did, is regarded as a very suspect methodology. You see, people do not trust that they will grasp objective reality through their spiritual comprehension and experience. They think that they will open the doors to the arbitrary, to all that is not objective, by introducing the slightest subjective tinge into their observations and experience. But this is Ahrimanic. Science is a kind of universal Americanism, insofar as it abides by the principle of discarding anything subjective from the observation of phenomena, and this developed from a former Luciferic spirit isolation in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. And so, we have added a new element to that old legacy, something which, alongside what must develop productively and consciously in future, increasingly reveals its destructive powers. This new element is largely Ahrimanic in nature, is fear of the spirit, and has a destructive effect, a dissolving effect on all human culture, which must, after all, be rooted in the spirit. At the turning point, from the fourth to the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, and especially during the fifth epoch, the impulses I have now described increasingly emerged. When America was discovered and European culture was transplanted there, this fear of the life of spirit developed. But a tension arose in human souls at the same time, for by their very nature, the powers at work in European souls had a sense or intimation of their connection with the spirit in the cosmos. At the transition from the fourth to the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, this tension emerged. During the centuries when modern history was developing, it was a tension due to a suppression of spirit in the human breast. You can say that this tension had to be stifled, partly through a clear understanding of the old legacy still present, and partly through a very realistic appraisal of the newly emerging Ahrimanic element. Here there arose the spiritual stream whose influence is actually much greater than most people believe. I spoke about this from a different angle last time. This spiritual stream, Jesuitism, sought to perpetuate the human soul's isolation from the realm of spirit. The inner principle of Jesuitism involves directing human evolution along a path that can keep people at a remove from their connection with the supersensible, from their real connection with it. It is self-evident that this distancing or detachment can be achieved all the better if the supersensible realm is presented in strict, dogmatic terms as something that human cognition cannot reach. But on the other hand, the Jesuit approach forges strong connections with modern science and Americanism, The greatness of Jesuitism lies in its deep engagement with the physical sciences. The Jesuits excel in the realm of the physical sensory sciences, since they count on our primary fear of the spirit, a human attribute that must be counteracted by guiding our nature toward the world of spirit. They count on being able to make a social construct of this fear by telling people that they cannot and ought not to approach the spirit, and that they, the Jesuits, will mediate it to everyone else. These two streams of Americanism and Jesuitism are in reciprocal interplay. But please do not take this too superficially. In all such things, we have to try to discover the deeper impulses at work in humanity's evolution. If you look for the forces that have created our present catastrophe, you will discover a curious collaboration between Americanism, as I have defined it here, and Jesuitism. In surveying these things, we find an old legacy working on in culture, on the one hand, and on the other, a new element. The Luciferic legacy and this new Ahrimanic element both stand in opposition to the true life of spirit as the redeeming element that humankind will need for its evolution. If we study a figure such as Bernard of Clairvaux with the right inner sympathy, we see that he tries to balance the physical sensory focus of human cognition by opening his soul to pious fervor and elemental experience to the spiritual and the divine. The quality of enthusiasm enters his being. This one-sided inclination for the spirit in human souls has a correlate in our own time, with an inclination toward the dark side of things. In the 12th century we had Bernard of Clairvaux, while our own century has figures like Lenin and Trotsky. Whereas we see an impulse toward the supersensible in the first instance, in these modern figures we find a hatred for the supersensible, albeit expressed in other words and content. That is the dark reverse of those earlier times. On the one hand, the human soul pours itself into the divine, and on the other, human nature pours itself into the animalistic and brutish, with the aim of sustaining nothing but social structure. But we can only understand this if we are absolutely clear about one thing, which is, however, very alien to modern comprehension. Our modern world sets great store by theories, believing in the content of programmatic ideas. I have often discussed this. Theoretical content is never the decisive thing, for what matters is the reality that takes effect, the efficacy of an idea. Before the World War, at the turn of the century, a modern Marxist would naturally have quoted the teachings of Marx, Engels, and Lassalle as highly desirable doctrines for securing the well-being of humanity. People set great store by the content of programs and schemas, but such things are never what count in reality. Ideas never unfold in accordance with their content, but through powers present in them, quite distinct from their content. We only understand reality if we realize that ideas often have very little to do with reality, but that their content has a separate existence alongside it. You can devise a beautiful plan, very well thought out, and can be inordinately pleased with it and enthusiastic about it, as we have seen in the case of Marxists. But none of this counts. For an era as unspiritual as ours, this is just playing with fire. People think they are working to realize their ideas, yet anyone who knows how life develops will also know that quite different effects will come about from the intended ones. Ideas, we can say, give rise to monstrosities in cultural life if they are not received with spiritual understanding. But the ideas of Marxism cannot be received spiritually, since they seek to eradicate the spirit. They will inevitably become monstrous, however lovely they appear. We should leave ideas to one side. Instead of thinking day has come on the earth by some power inherent in the earth itself, we should realize that day dawns because the sun rises. Let me read that again. Instead of thinking day has come on the earth by some power inherent in the earth itself, we should realize that day dawns because the sun rises. You can only explain the dawning day by looking beyond the immediate environment of the earth. And in the same way, you can only understand current events by looking back to the distant past. You fail to understand Bolshevism if you overlook the fact that it is a consequence or after effect of the Eighth Ecumenical Council in the year 869. You have to see Bolshevism as a result of the withering of spiritual powers that perceive the supersensible world. This is the inner connection needed for properly understanding what happens in the outer world and for taking the right stance toward it. Those who can trace the threads of history find it appalling to see movements which think arrogantly that they can reform the world, but which only count on the content of ideas without due regard to real effects. The content of an idea alone, however, fine or ugly, has nothing to do with it. Look at it like this. A child is born, a beautiful child. Its mother may be delighted. Mothers can, of course, be delighted even if the child is not so beautiful. The child grows up and becomes a good-for-nothing, perhaps a criminal. This does not mean, does it, that the child was not beautiful to start with? We are still entitled to perceive the child's beauty. It seems to us that there is a contradiction between such beauty and later events that were not envisaged. In the same way, ideas live amongst certain groups of people who admire them and wish to use them to reform the world. But these ideas turn into monsters. You see, in themselves ideas are something dead and must first be enlivened by flowing into a living cultural context. If you read modern socialist tracts and overlook certain differences between them, you will find that despite dealing with different aspects of life and formulated in different ways, they actually very closely resemble tracts produced by Catholicism. Recently, for instance, I read you some passages from a pamphlet. If you compare the thought forms in this pamphlet, the mode of thinking, with rampant socialist ideas tending toward Bolshevism, this whole anti-cultural trend, then you will find the same ideas, basically as in a text by Lenin or Kautsky. The one is a development of the other. Reading certain dogmatic socialist tracts, you quickly feel you are very much in a Catholic world, it quotes. The only real difference is that something forbidden in Catholicism, philosophizing about certain subjects, becomes a passion, a principle in Bolshevism. All knowledge and mental progress must be explained in terms of the class war. This principle arises from the principle of Catholicism. In its current form, Bolshevism may only have a short existence, but humanity will long be plagued by what underlies it. We have to look clearly at all these things to realize how necessary it is for us to cultivate the right kind of spiritual life. Pie-in-the-sky thinking is of no use. What we need is to use spiritual perception to see reality clearly and discover the connecting threads. Only if we grasp the full context can we intervene properly in world events, rather than living from old legacies or becoming fearful as new elements enter culture, which can only lead us into deep chaos. Into chaos. In the brutish forms of socialism, we have to see an elaboration of what developed in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. This contains something Luciferic, the Luciferic fall. What is happening now is like the punishment for this original sin. The powers that were not applied to supersensible perception have now really become incapable of it. And this is accompanied by hatred of and repugnance for the supersensible. This is indeed a kind of punishment for the fact that we turned away from the supersensible, and this can explain much that is currently happening in the world. Impulses at work in human evolution come to expression in diverse ways, with different aspects and nuances. We can only understand what is happening in the world today by understanding these nuances. As Christianity spread, it took root in the people of Italy and Spain, and likewise in the population of what is now France and the British Isles. We know that the sentient soul was retained in Spain and Italy, while the rational or mind soul developed in French regions, the consciousness soul in the British Isles, and the I here in Central Europe. In Eastern Europe, similarly, a culture of the spirit self will arise, though at present this exists only in hidden germinal form and will unfold in the future. If only people would consider Western Europe in the light which spiritual science can shed on it. For instance, Italian traits, not the characteristics of individual Italians, who of course can grow beyond mere regional stereotypes, develop differently from those of the French or British. In Britain, national characteristics are connected with the consciousness soul. I have described these things in the past. Through this mode of life in the consciousness soul, a person is driven out into the plane of physical reality, though this is less marked in the British Isles than in America. As a result of this, having been cut off from the supersensible by ecclesiastical developments, the human being is now led toward the cosmic realm again, but as far as the consciousness soul is concerned, only toward external aspects of the cosmos. This means that the British only connect with the cosmos through economic principles. British thinking is largely informed by economics, by economic categories. If you grasp the interconnection between the consciousness soul and the physical world, you will see the inevitability of this, and likewise you will see how inevitable it is that the stereotype French character, not necessarily that of a French individual, develops political thinking in its close relationship with a rational or mind soul. Similarly, national characteristics in Italy and Spain develop a close connection with animality because of the direct involvement here of the sentient soul. I am only briefly outlining these things, but they do convey qualities that live in national characteristics. If we consider German characteristics, which are currently involved in such tragic developments, we find that they draw upon the I capital. Light is shed on all of German history, if we consider this fact, which becomes apparent through perception of the world of spirit. This human I, undergoing the least degree of outward development, remains our most spiritual aspect. And this is why German people, through the I, have the strongest spiritual connection with the world of spirit. They cannot forge an economic, political, or animal connection with the cosmos. Instead, they connect with it only as it manifests in cultural life through the soul of particular individuals. For the I always lives in individualities, and then flows out into the wider nation. German developments are apparent most characteristically in the substance of Goetheanism and in the conceptions of Herder or Lessing, which lie one level higher than the physical sensory plane of existence. For this reason, one finds here a certain quality of alienation or distance from the physical realm, a feeling that these ideas and conceptions cannot fully belong to the physical sensory realm. And this, in turn, is why in recent decades so much Americanism on the one hand, and on the other so much that I do not wish to describe in further detail here, has streamed through Germany and alienated it from its inherent national characteristics. Eastern Europe will forge a connection with the Spirit in a still higher way, developing a still more spiritual culture in opposition to what is now emerging for reasons I have described. But this is something for the future and is not yet present, is still confined within brutish tendencies from which it will seek to emerge. The countries of Western Europe are still connected with the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, as though by rightful inheritance and tradition. A newer element, although opposed to Americanism, lies in German nature, a certain relationship with the world of spirit, sought within the realm of spirit itself. A German, in following the inner dictates of his own inherent nature, does not fear the spirit, but has a devoted inclination for it, as we find, for example, in typical, albeit higher form, in Goetheanism. In saying such things, of course, one has to express them rather radically, not out of chauvinism, but through perception of realities. I definitely do not say this to curry favor with anyone. As you saw last time, I am capable of saying things, if necessary, that might equally cause offense. But this must be said. It has largely been forgotten in Central Europe that German nature manifests a connection between the human spirit and the supersensible world, and that this connection, which needs to be further developed, stands in complete opposition to everything else coming to expression on earth today. If only we could recognize this, the past few decades would not, sadly, have brought us Americanism in this realm, and Bolshevism, and science and scholarship would have developed in a different way in Central Europe. From my past reflections, you know that Goetheanism could have given rise to a spiritual deepening of science and knowledge, but that Goetheanism remained in the margins, becoming only a one-sided pursuit also. Was it understood? Not so far. Yet it is the essence of German nature, and, as you can see from what I have said today, alien to other forms of scholarship and other national traits, which draw to a very large extent on old legacies and the new elements I described, as it were, emerging from their shells. We can see in various ways how Goetheanism has remained at one remove from materialistic science. Of course, people praise Goethe, yet at the same time, as I said, they appoint a former finance minister as president of the Goethe Society. The intrinsic element in German nature is something one has to feel as a continual reproach in other domains. People tend to defend themselves against something their own nature prevents them from acknowledging by scorning it. We must face this head on. People cast scorn on anything they feel to be a reproach to them, taking refuge in this subjective defensiveness. This is an important psychological reality. Such scorn will become ever more widespread, and it will be rooted in a sense of discomfort at the distinctive relationship of the I to the spirit. We must not flinch from seeing this clearly. If we ourselves did not have so much Philistinism and Americanism in us, we would recognize the two opposite poles at work here, German Goetheanism and Americanism, and we would know that we can only adopt the right stance to currents flowing through the modern world if we can observe them with an entirely open mind. We ought to shed all chauvinism and see things objectively. If we did so, however, we would no longer laud Americanism to the skies, as we have been wont to do. And since the characteristic trait of this Americanism is fear of the spirit, would come to see that the American element will increasingly act as a radically evil driving force in current catastrophic events. Those who see it differently are short-sighted, because they cannot survey the whole context. all that arises from the French political element, from the purely economic rigidity natural to the British, from the animal furor and sacred egotism of the Italian people, is as nothing to the larger scheme of things compared to the truly evil element emerging from Americanism. You see, there are three currents whose inner affinity and confluence produces a destructive effect upon human evolution. In diverse ways, each has assimilated old legacies and a new element, as I tried to outline briefly today. The destructiveness lies in these three currents. Firstly, in everything we can call Americanism, which increasingly tends to invoke fear of the spirit and make the world into a place where only physical life can unfold. This is actually quite different from the British tendency to try to make the world into a trading company. Americanism seeks to make it into a physical habitation, furnished as comfortably as possible, where one can live in comfort and prosperity. That is the political element of Americanism. If you cannot see this, you do not discern realities, are half asleep. The influence of this current will lead to the death of the human being's connection with the world of spirit. There lies in these American forces something that leads the earth to its end, a destructive element that ultimately spells annihilation for the earth, since it blocks off the spirit. The second destructive current is not just Catholicism, but all Jesuitism, which has a close affinity with Americanism. Whereas Americanism seeks to cultivate a fear of the spirit, Jesuitism tries to awaken a belief that we should not ourselves reach toward the spirit, which is beyond us, but allow spiritual wellsprings to be administered instead by those whom the Catholic Church appoints as its ministers. This current, too, wants the human powers which seek the spirit to wither. And the third current, emerging today in the East in such terrible symptoms, has its source in a socialism that addresses nothing but the human animal. Without seeing this dogmatically, Bolshevism has to be recognized as something it will be hard for humanity to overcome. These are the three destructive elements at work in modern humanity. To recognize them so as to oppose them in the right way, wherever they surface in current events, is something only possible when we stand on spiritual, scientific foundations. And next week I will speak further of this. In our recent reflections, you will have seen that we are trying to shape ideas drawn from spiritual science in ways that can serve us when we seek to understand events occurring on a daily or hourly basis in our modern culture. Today, as a kind of last appendix to these reflections, I will offer what can be no more than aphoristic characterizations of our modern era, and connect these with various fundamental aspects introduced in the course of these lectures. It is particularly noticeable today that of all the hindrances and obstacles apparent in modern culture, the mode of thinking, the nature of our ideas as these have evolved over recent centuries, gives people little capacity of foresight for approaching events. This becomes clear in the surprise experienced when events overtake us, seemingly without any capacity on our part to predict them, or to believe that this might be possible. People think that what happens cannot be predicted, and that they must simply allow events to overtake them. Whenever one speaks of forthcoming occurrences, people are very surprised, or else they ironically discount this supposed longing for prophetic powers. If one draws attention to things now spreading across the globe from far eastern regions, emerging from causes I have recently commented on here, one meets with little understanding even though such developments are only too apparent. There is far too little desire to form real insights, and connected with this, so little will to engage with truths that point without natural limits to what will happen in future. Of course, I am not speaking, as you will realize, of any kind of soothsaying or misguided prophecy, but of a serious, scholarly outlook and mode of thought. This reluctance or inability to prefigure future developments has deep roots, but in general we can say that people are unaware of how far back the causes of things lie, and that on the whole they seek these causes in things that are far too close or superficial. If I try to describe the causes of this relative blindness, I must seek it in a deeply rooted tendency in human souls today to embrace dead concepts and ideas rather than living ones. It is, of course, understandable that people cannot think about what is coming toward them in the same concept as they have formed of past events. But today people only give credence to what, as they say, can be, in quotes, proven. And in seeking such proof, they turn to that particular form of evidence of which they are nowadays so enamored. A clear understanding of this particular mode of proof will show us that it serves only to confirm truths that relate to everything in decline in the universe, everything that is dying. This is why people today want a science, or just a mode of perception, that relates only to everything which dies. People who think themselves most enlightened have a predilection for knowledge and also for a form of will that relates to dying things. In the broadest sense, there is a prevailing trend today, even if we are unaware of this, to engage only with decline. We fail to find the courage to conceive of living growth, since this cannot be encompassed in such rigid and narrowly defined terms, nor proven in the same way as decline or fading, dying tendencies. People defend themselves fiercely against more living forms of knowledge. If one stands up and opposes such things, as one must, one runs the risk of being called a ridiculous fantasist and dilettante, or perhaps even worse. People today try to formulate concepts that can arm them against having to think of things with germinal potential for the future. Those who consider themselves most intelligent inoculate themselves against such fruitful thinking with concepts such as the, quote, conservation of matter and energy, close quote, as this principle is nowadays formulated. Anyone who does not subscribe to this, quote, fundamental scientific principle, close quote, is regarded in certain circles, of course, as a, in quotes, blockhead. And yet, true perception of the cosmos will show us that matter and energy are transient and pass away, and that all knowledge we can gain of matter and energy is a knowledge of their transience. It is actually precisely because people wish to have a science of transient things, wish only to allow fading and dying things to figure in science, that they dogmatically decree that substance or energy are eternal, to have at least something they can hold fast to. This law of the conservation of matter and energy also plays an important role for lay people with no scientific training, and they project it vaguely into everything. The idea of the conservation of matter and substance thus finds its way into all popular textbooks and all contemporary thinking, becoming a supposed self-evident truth for people. But we know from our reading of Title Occult Science that evolution has passed through phases we refer to as those of Saturn, Sun, Moon, and Earth. Nothing of what we refer to nowadays as substance and energy will endure beyond the stage of venous evolution. By then, even the most permanent of substances will have come to its end. We are now past the midpoint of planetary evolution, and are currently in the 5th period of the Earth phase of this evolution, somewhat beyond its midpoint. Having passed this midpoint, we are already living in a declining phase of Earth evolution, or in other words, in a phase of decline in which substance and energy are fading away again. And when we study physics and chemistry, we would discern things properly if we recognize that insights gained in these fields relate only to transient things that will have disappeared no later than by the stage of venous evolution. Nothing upon which modern science focuses today will ultimately endure, and the ideas and concepts invoked today to offer the kinds of proof of which people are so enamored relate only to this kind of transience. The whole of science concerns itself with transient things. We need to radically correct these ideas in this most fundamental of areas. And those who consider themselves to be the best trained scientists will need to learn a great deal if they are to replace their current concepts with true ones. But why am I saying all this? It may well seem to you that in general such a thing is of no great importance. Actually, it is. You see, these ideas which people acquire and which then live in all their thinking inform other ideas and concepts according to which people live, and inform also their will and actions. Social concepts, political ideas, are informed by the mode of thinking thus developed. They are formed in accordance with the distinctive use one makes of such forces, whereby thoughts and concepts are considered to be only transient. And this has a knock-on effect on people's daily thinking. We can see this in particularly striking form if we study the social programs of those who consider themselves the most progressive, the programs of many socialists, for instance, which are all the rage in many circles, and are all based in one way or another on the theory formulated by Karl Marx. Marxism is currently the bane of Russia, because, for reasons I explained last time, it informs current historical developments there. This Marxist outlook is at the same time the most extreme expression of the will to engage only with and control dying things. If you study Marxist ideas, you find that the most fanatical Marxists believe they possess ideas of great future potential. And yet, in fact, these ideas can only relate to everything that fades and withers. This appears in a naive way, especially in this, in quotes, socialist outlook, since it invariably refuses to establish any fruitful ideas of the future. Instead, it preaches the eradication of ideas, propounding the abolition of all that currently exists, as a way of allowing something new to emerge by itself miraculously out of the resulting turmoil and confusion. I'm putting this radically, but then there are many, too, who, as we saw in the last lecture, abide by the teachings of the Church through many centuries and interpret the events of recent centuries in dogmatic ecclesiastical terms. And so we must say that this outlook basically entirely refuses to cultivate ideas of future potential. It seeks only to produce ideas that can destroy all that has been established in the past. Those who propound these doctrines think there is future potential in their ideas, but what counts is how ideas become reality. In truth, these ideas have no potential to establish anything new, but are concerned only to introduce destruction into existing institutions. This socialism appears to me like a lady, though of course I'm harking back to the past here, who cannot bear to wear crinoline and detests hooped petticoats. This must change, says she. And what does she do? She lines it inside so that it looks just the same as it did before, outwardly, but is now lined with padding. This is what the socialists are doing. Instead of using new ideas to make fruitful the institutions that have emerged in the course of history, they leave them as they are, basically, simply taking the place of those who once administered these institutions. They preserve the petticoats and pad them out with lining. Here too we find an extreme outlook, embodied in nothing but a longing to administer and manage all that is fading and dying. What is the cause of this? It is because the concepts in today's merely sense-based science, founded on a reasoning faculty that recognizes sensory perception alone, can only engage with all that withers and dies. It can only meet with elements of nature that lead toward death, not its living aspects. Science cannot comprehend life and living things. In culture, too, life is not comprehended, not germinal growth, but only what dies. You see, this germinal growth can only be encompassed in imaginations, by attaining at least the first level of higher knowledge, as I have described in Title Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. To reach certain higher forms of knowledge, relating to perception of growing living things, we also need to be able to employ intuition and inspiration. In approaching phenomena with past concepts, people can go on talking till the cows come home, but they will never get beyond an engagement with decline and death, unless they enter into what supersensible faculties alone can perceive of growth and life. Today things really are on a knife edge. Without certain forms of knowledge, without perception of the spirit, humanity will plunge into cultural chaos, which we are already familiar enough with. We need a renewal of the mysteries, and this is also something that the science of the spirit seeks to attain. For this, of course, the meaning of the ancient mysteries first has to be grasped, and then also the meaning of the period of history, which was, in a sense, an intermediate phase between these ancient mysteries and the new ones that are still to come. All this must be understood. Pupils of the ancient mysteries were astonished to find, as they were taught in vivid ways, that ancient atavistic, clairvoyant faculties and occult knowledge were inevitably declining. This was something they could not grasp themselves through their knowledge and vision, for it could be comprehended only through initiation into the mysteries. They were taught that something else, another condition, would dawn in humanity, replacing ancient clairvoyant vision of the world of spirit. Mystery pupils were shown that this old form of soul condition, this appearance of world breadths in imagination, was on its way out. This was explained to them roughly as follows. What can be seen on earth with the physical senses does not as such contain the intrinsic secrets of earth existence. These secrets can only be revealed if the human soul is granted clairvoyant vision of the mysteries of the cosmos and all extra-telluric reality, so that what happens in the extra-telluric cosmos dawns in this soul. This was what ancient clairvoyant vision showed, the non-physical realities of the spiritual cosmos, rather than what was happening on earth. And these mystery pupils were taught that such knowledge and perception, this ascent into the cosmos, would no longer be possible in future. And those who were to penetrate the Christ mystery were granted insight into something else as well. This, roughly, was the conception that arose. Although ancient seers did not speak of Christ, their inspirations came from the world in which Christ had always dwelt, since he is a cosmic being. Christ lives in the whole cosmos, and everything streaming from it as this is revealed to atavistic clairvoyance. But from the time when the mystery of Golgotha was to occur, people no longer had access to this as they once had. What happened? Well, the Christ descended from this world, from the cosmos, down to earth. Christ had to descend to humankind, because the spiritual cosmos was no longer accessible to people as it had once been in ancient times, and they could no longer have found Christ there by the old means. It died away, this mode of knowledge and sensibility of soul, in which the world where Christ lived was formerly perceived. And therefore Christ had to descend to humankind. And so he did. And thus everything which illumined minds had ever perceived of the world of spirit, in ancient heathen mystery rites and in heathen mystery knowledge, had now to be comprised in the Christ. Vision of it had to be found in Christ. We have to realize what kind of cosmic being had descended to the earth from the cosmos as Christ. That is one aspect. The other was as follows. Reason and the senses, as I said, can only perceive transient things. A knowledge of transience when they consider all of nature, and social and cultural life too. Everything now existing will come to an end by the Venus phase of evolution. Despite believing that cultural ideas about society, have growth potential, people very often stand in the stream of decline as they entertain them. What the senses perceive, and all that can be grasped by reason, has no germ of future potential, but is wedded to death. If this were all that existed, there would only be death knowledge, for the reality that surrounds us is itself wedded to death. Where can we look to find anything enduring, therefore? Where can we find a realm of eternal reality that will survive beyond this outward existence of ours, which is wedded to death? Where do we find something truly conserved? Atoms and forces which are thought to endure forever, according to belief systems and superstitions, rooted in the physical will, in fact go under. We find this only in the human being himself. Of all creatures, animals, plants, minerals, all the air, water, and everything else that will go under, there is one thing only that will be preserved beyond earthly evolution and other phases of evolution that follow it. And this is what lives within ourselves. Only we human beings bear within us on earth something that endures. It is misguided to speak of the conservation of atoms and matter. We can speak only of the conservation of something within ourselves. Yet this can be perceived only by means of imagination, inspiration, and intuition. Nothing that is not perceived by supersensible perception endures. Everything in the sensory world is transient, and the supersensible, which endures, can therefore also only be encompassed by supersensible perception. We walk upon the earth, and within us lies everything that will survive of earth existence. If we wonder where to look for the germ of what will survive the earth, Jupiter and Venus phases of evolution, and what of modern culture will endure into a culture of the future, we have to recognize that nothing of the physical earth and cosmos will survive, but only what lies within us. In the part of our being which is accessible only to supersensible perception, we find something that bears the germ of the future. We cannot really speak of the future at all unless we have the will to comprehend the supersensible. Otherwise our ideas of the future are false. And this is why the Christ had to descend from worlds that were becoming ever more unavailable to human perception. He had to unite with the human being, establishing his dwelling place in Jesus, and thus becoming Jesus Christ. Because only in a human body could be found the future potential of earthly evolution. In Christ we thus have the cosmic element, which was directly comprehended only through ancient perception, and in Jesus, to whom the Christ came, we have the only possible bearer of the germ of the future in the human will. We fail to understand Christ if we see him only as Christ, or only as Jesus. The Christ of whom the ancient teachings of Docetism spoke, and a kind of Gnostic doctrine, can no longer be comprehended, and was available only to ancient clairvoyants. We do not understand Jesus if we fail to grasp that Christ entered him. If we do not acknowledge Christ within Jesus, we do not comprehend that only through the germ of humanity on earth will cosmic reality be rescued for the future. To understand that Christ Jesus is a dual being is a great and important task. Yet at the same time, many have sought to hinder such understanding. In modern times, diverse efforts have been made to assign to oblivion the knowledge that Christ lived in Jesus. On the one hand, we have the extreme theological doctrine that speaks only of the simple man of Nazareth, and thus really only of a person endowed with our ordinary sensory nature, rather than of the one who bears the germ of our future potential. Then there is a society, too, that was founded to oppose the idea of Christ, and to this end to establish a false idea of Jesus, the Society of the Jesuits, which largely exists to drive out the Christ from the Jesus Christ picture, leaving only Jesus as a kind of tyrant looming over evolving humanity. All this must be seen in context. The diverse impulses to which I am referring act more powerfully in modern life than people realize. They act very powerfully and intensely. If we do not open our eyes fully to these things and seek to grasp the real effects of what is happening, we will continually be surprised by all that comes. In many respects, our modern culture is far too sluggish to recognize such things. Spiritual scientific concepts are far too difficult for many, and people therefore denigrate them as unscientific fantasy and dilettantism. For reasons I have explained, they condemn themselves at the same time to dispensing with anything of real future potential. Around us we see a wasteland today, and chaos into which old religious confessions and cultural traditions have led us. In the midst of this chaos, which people very naively regard as war, although it has gone far beyond warfare to become something quite different, we find a wasteland of ideas and outlooks. Only by grasping the supersensible, the spiritual realm, would ideas arise that are not barren. Today we must decide either to engage with decline and death and become a pupil of Lenin, or to reckon with the supersensible, which encompasses what must emerge in future. I am not talking about the lone individual Lenin, whose ideas are currently causing such mischief in Eastern Europe. I take him more as the symbol of a chronic condition, for there are many Lenins spread far and wide in one field or another. The realm of dying and death is the only one people are seeking out and engaging with at present. Let us recall something I once said here, that a plant lives and can be described as a living entity. But when modern science tackles plant life today, it does not find a living quality, which is supersensible, but describes substances that are the vehicle for life, the dead mineral aspects. In modern science you will find an account only of the mineral, and in fact death-bearing constituents of living things. And therefore people cannot raise themselves to really fruitful ideas about nature. The concepts prevalent in modern botany do not accord with life. Instead, they describe the minerals that make up living entities and circulate within them. As soon as one goes beyond this circulating mineral element in plant, animal, or the human being, each of these is found to be quite different in nature from the way it is usually described. Consider the zoologist von Uexküll. Let me say that again. Uexküll, who wrote an essay entitled The Battle for the Soul of the Animal. This gentleman displays a masochistic cruelty in relation to all psychology or anything the least related to it. I say in quotes masochistic cruelty because of the following sentiments in his essay. Quote, "There is no need to determine whether there is such a thing as the soul or not, but only that science cannot make anything of it." Close quote. A properly cruel or ferocious person actually kills something, whereas someone who is masochistically cruel, like this Mr. Uexküll, just dabbles a little in killing, tries it out. This is typical of modern science, though people fail to notice because they turn aside from it. People do not like rupturing the partition that sunders them from their surroundings, and so they cannot break through to find the concepts that are really needed for understanding these surroundings. From the science of the Spirit, we know that the core, integral nature of the human being descends from worlds of spirit and connects with our flesh and blood, the material covering in which we are enclosed between birth and death, or rather between conception and death. Nowadays, scientists study issues surrounding conception and birth, embryonic development. But these fields cannot be studied, since this research addresses only the dead elements embedded in life. This will never enable people to understand the only thing that can make the human being comprehensible: the fact that when we descend from worlds of spirit, we are received by father and mother and then pass through the whole of fetal development. Science today holds to the arrogant view that a father and mother give a child its existence, and that since they are the core of the family, and the family is the foundation for social community, so social communities, as enlarged families, think that they own the human being. But this mean little idea is very far from the truth. What does a human being receive in the act of conception, and what does he gain from it? We receive here, as spiritual science can show us, the capacity to become a mortal creature. The act of conception endows us with the possibility of dying. This is the inevitable consequence of other things I have described in various books. At the moment of conception already, we integrate into us what makes it possible for us to die here on earth. The whole of life from birth to death is a development toward death, and death is inoculated into us at conception. Our nature as living entity and human being is not somehow created at conception, but instead this moment inoculates our otherwise immortal being with the opportunity to die. Parents, in fact, can only give their offspring the gift of death, although this is putting it radically, of course, the opportunity to bear a mortal body here on earth. The life within this body has to descend from the spiritual world. What descends from the world of spirit enables this whole organism of ours, the whole mechanism with which we are clothed on earth, which we receive at conception with the germ of death, to be alive. We need to learn to connect the human being again, in his most tangible appearance, with the evolution of the spiritual cosmos. And to do this, we have to move beyond cowardly fears and timid apprehensions to really tackle the loftiest problems facing science. If we shy away from them, we will not even understand the things that live in our closest proximity. We can say that the most diverse peoples live also in our immediate proximity. Just think of the misguided thoughts which Woodrow Wilson has summoned from the idea of nations and peoples. We have often spoken of this. We have to realize that the idea of different races will never be properly understood if we do not engage with the whole of earthly evolution. Why is it that the population of the globe has been divided into these different races and nations? Spiritual science teaches us that world evolution began with the Saturn embodiment of the Earth, followed by the Sun embodiment, the Moon stage, and now our current Earth stage. This will be followed by a Jupiter embodiment, and so forth. But we should not see this too schematically, with an ancient Saturn planet transforming smoothly into the Sun and Moon and Earth stages. Rather, this evolution is a continuous alternation in which the Sun first separates from the Earth, and then the Moon does. Bodies separate, then reunite, and separate again. What I have just referred to as cosmic evolution, involving this separation, played a part in ancient clairvoyance. What can be summed up as the human germ of the future remained unconsciously present in this clairvoyance, remained phonic, as it is called in ancient seership, in the ongoing advance of earthly evolution. You see, what comes from the universe was destined to die, and was preserved only by virtue of Luciferic power. And thus diverse differentiations entered from the cosmos and developed into nations and races. But these cosmic forces were impregnated with Luciferic powers. In contrast to these diverse, differentiated peoples, there stands, as was understood by a better era than our own, the universal human. And this has a quite different origin. We can speak of this in the abstract, but we will only speak of its reality by truly grasping the germ of the future within us, which contains nothing national or nationalistic. This is a quality that did not descend from the cosmos, but which Christ approached and united himself with. The Christ did not unite himself with any national trait, as, say, Jehovah did, but instead with the universal human. He was in the community of gods, from whom nations developed, but he departed from this realm when it was ripe for decline, came to earth, and took up dwelling in the universal human. It is the greatest blasphemy to invoke the name of Jesus Christ for anything partisan, for anything other than the universal human. And it is in this sense only that we can say, not I, but Christ in me. This is one of the most vital insights for the future. To understand Christ Jesus' relationship to humanity, and also to grasp that everything of a national or nationalistic nature is outside the realm of Christ Jesus, and is an old residue of something that was already ripe for decline at the time of the mystery of Golgotha. All things cling on beyond their time like withered fruit. What was ripe for decline has clung on only as a science that turns its focus upon decline and death, and which, like modern science or the social sciences, concerns itself only with ideas that can engage with decline, either all that withers and dies in nature or cultural decline. In cultural history, we can sometimes see a real clash occurring between this decline, which seeks to live in dead abstract ideas, considering them significant, and the impulse to grasp hold of the human seed, which alone has future potential. I have frequently referred to an important conversation between Goethe and Schiller, when these two were once at a meeting of the Research Association in Jena. The botanist Bach had given a lecture, and as Schiller was leaving, he said to Goethe, "This botanical approach fragments everything, dispels all unifying impetus." At this, Goethe, in a few characteristic strokes, described to Schiller his approach to plant metamorphosis. And then the latter said, "But that is not your experience. It is just an idea." Schiller was unable to raise himself to vision of the human being who bears the future within him, nor of the resulting ability to find in turn a future-sustaining power in the world, which is the supersensible. and therefore he replied to Goethe that the latter's perception was not experience or observation, but merely an idea. And Goethe responded by saying, "Well, then I see my ideas with my eyes." He felt what he was describing to be something he also saw, and was as real to him as anything he might have observed with his physical senses. Here then we have two figures face to face. Schiller, who could not raise his perception to the supersensible, but entertained only the dead abstract idea, and Goethe, who sought to draw from what he perceived in nature something that bears futurity within it, the eternal in the human being, for whom everything transient is but a metaphor. He sought to unite what he perceived outside him with something eternal. And he was not understood because he had vision of something supersensible and enduring, and looked upon this as if observing sensory phenomena. What our time needs, therefore, is to develop this Goethean approach. Insight will only come when we realize that something like the diverse religious confessions, including those founded on the Old Testament, and especially Catholicism, are only a perpetuation of something old that has clung on past its time, a withered branch of evolution that has to assert itself through outward power structures. This redundant impetus is accompanied by something that seeks to bear nothing but transience, impermanence, into the future, and this is Americanism. And this explains the affinity between Americanism and Jesuitism, as I described it last time. Goetheanism stands in opposition to all such phenomena. In saying this, I don't wish to fix dogmatically on a name. One has to use names to point to something that goes far beyond a name's narrower scope. By Goetheanism, I do not mean what Goethe thought up in 1832, but rather what may take another millennium or so to be thought along Goethean lines. All that can develop from Goethe's vision and ideas. It is due to this that everything clinging to withering powers regards Goetheanism in any form as its enemy. Here we can witness the greatest cultural paradoxes. It is highly paradoxical that one of the most inventive books on Goethe was, however unlikely this seems, written by a Jesuit, Father Baumgartner. This is a book that delves deeply into Goethe. It is characteristic, of course, that anything associated with Jesuitism will oppose Goethe, and this is a spirited, deep book, not flitting superficially over its subject. It really does summon the man and describe him vividly, unlike another book by the English aristocrat Lewes, who calls Goethe a mere 18th century Philistine to whom no regard is due. The Jesuit book on Goethe, on the other hand, reveals a real cultural paradox, and here one can see the opposing forces that clash within one author's mind. On a smaller scale, we find the same thing in our own circles. As long as we were regarded as a small sect, in quotes, few people bothered attacking Anthroposophy. But now that it has greater prominence, the fiercest attacks are launched on us, particularly by Jesuit circles. It no longer suffices for the periodical titled Stimmen der Zeit to publish an article opposing us, but it devotes whole issues to the subject. This is why I keep emphasizing that we should not think that we will appeal to the better nature of these circles by explaining to them that we are invoking Christ, that we are cultivating an understanding of Christ. These people are fiercely opposed to such a thing. This is precisely what they want to prevent. Anything that is not a part of ecclesiastical doctrine should not be asserted about Christ, in their view. Let us therefore cease to be so naive as to believe that we can appease Catholicism by explaining that we are good Christians. It is this very thing, that we do all in our power to nurture Christianity, that makes Catholicism our greatest enemy. Such naivete in regard to these things must increasingly be banished from our circles. Instead, we should become ever more discerning, clear-sighted about the powers, both declining and dawning, that live around us. We must reach further than the small longing so prevalent amongst us to seek just a little bit more of an imaginative faculty. I have often said this. Instead of securing ourselves just a little bit of an imaginative world, we must be able to relate our spiritual science to contemporary cultural ideas, becoming keen observers of what actually lives in the modern world. Only spiritual science gives a perspective that can enable us to really observe this world. Many come to me and tell me that they have seen one thing or another. Well, they certainly have. Imaginations are not so far removed from human evolution, and will increasingly approach us. Many ask me, for instance, whether it was the guardian of the threshold they saw. But it is not so easy just to reply yes or no to such a question, since the answer encompasses the whole of human evolution. Yet the answers have been given. At present I am revising my book titled Occult Science, a new edition of which is about to be published. And I find that it actually includes everything needed to answer such questions. All necessary caution with regard to them, all checks and balances one needs, are carefully described there. The feelings one needs to develop are described there too, and these things are clearly indicated, although you will have to read the book with sufficient care to see this. I would have had to write 30 volumes to explain every detail of what is contained in occult science. In reading this book, you have to think for yourself too and draw your own conclusions, and this is perfectly possible. I don't like writing huge tomes, but if you read this book carefully, you will discover that certainly seeking the supersensible world will bring you an encounter with the guardian of the threshold. Yet this encounter is not as simple or straightforward as having a dreamy imagination, which is the most comfortable way of entering the world of spirit. The encounter with the guardian of the threshold is a tragedy, a battle for survival involving all concepts and laws of cognition and all human connections with the spiritual world, with Ahriman and Lucifer too. By encountering the guardian of the threshold, you enter catastrophic circumstances. If by contrast you see just a dreamlike imagination before you, this means that you are trying to slip easily past this encounter, to have a dream of the guardian of the threshold as substitute for the real encounter. It is necessary to approach these things with healthy thinking, which, as will then become apparent, contains the basis for curing all superstition and everything that opponents of spiritual science accuse it of. Besides this, a healthy mode of thinking that can raise itself to experience of the spiritual realm contains all germinal power we need in order to emerge from the current catastrophe in which the world is plunged. We will be led out of it by something that is not comprehended on earth, or not alone in the sensory realm, not in ruinous institutions that exploit and misuse resources, but in something that is not yet in existence. We must find burning enthusiasm for grasping something not yet present. Yet this can only be grasped by comprehending and pursuing a mode of supersensible knowledge rather than by looking back to the past. People such as Kautsky prefer to look back to the past and base their view of humanity's future on anthropology. To understand present social conditions, they study past states when we were as yet scarcely human. Those such as Kautsky are the true sons of a misunderstood Catholicism. Yet looking back to the past like this will not help, since back then the foundations of our modern era were created only by atavistic instinctive powers. In the future, nothing will any longer be based on instinct. And if people try to draw on what is still present in them from ancient instinctive times, they will never reach the future potential in them that can lead us out of catastrophe. We need a true stance toward the world of spirit in order to develop a real, engaged, and serious understanding of the present. I would have to speak for many hours if I were to address such themes more fully and examine issues that are currently of much concern. But over the summer weeks, when we will not be meeting, you will come far in an understanding of the cosmic Christ and the earthly Jesus, if you really meditate on all we have been discussing here, culminating in the need to perceive a dual Christ-Jesus figure. You will see that the cosmic Christ descended from worlds of spirit, since these worlds were henceforth to be closed to human vision. And because the human being was destined to grasp the seed of future potential that lies within himself. In this cosmic Christ, and in the earthly, the humanistic Jesus, and the union of both, lies much that can help solve the riddle of the cosmos, at least the part of it that concerns humanity. Within the human being lies the seed of the future. But this seed must be fertilized by Christ Jesus. If this does not happen, the seed will become aromanically configured, and the earth will end in error and confusion. Thus we find solutions to a great many contemporary questions by fathoming the Christ Jesus secret. But you should not seek these solutions in a superficial way, through what is often regarded as theosophy, mysticism, or such like, through some, quote, union with the Spirit, close quote, or a, quote, merging with the universe, close quote. Instead, try to really discern what is happening around us today and to comprehend it through what you draw from the science of the Spirit. As all kinds of issues start to be resolved, you will increasingly discover that humanity today truly seeks practical, not theoretical answers. If it does not try to cultivate the Spirit, it will find itself in a cul-de-sac and be forced to acknowledge that it cannot get any further. Wherever we fail to pursue the Spirit, to journey spiritually, we will find that our efforts wither on the bough. Whether or not people will strive spiritually is of great importance for humanity's future. Today I want to plant in your hearts a sense of the feelings that can emerge and develop from our recent reflections. It is also very likely that this is the last time we will meet in this hall, which we have become fond of over many years, and where many of these lectures have been held. These were the first premises we furnished in accordance with our own ideas, although of course only within a given scope. We furnished it as we did because our spiritual scientific endeavors ought not to be something merely theoretical, but should come to expression in everything that surrounds our human encounters. This hall is now being taken from us, and we must seek another. But naturally, in present circumstances, we will not be able to furnish it in the same way that we furnished this one. We will have to make do with whatever premises we find. We have become attached to this hall, since it cannot be assumed that we can speak of our connection with the Spirit elsewhere in the same way as here, where we attempted to configure some aspects of the space as we did on a larger scale in Dornach. In earlier times we often had to make do. Some among you may still recall us holding lectures in a pub. I stood there with an audience in front of me, and behind me the publican was drawing pints. On another occasion we gathered in a kind of barn. We had been promised a different space, but we were only given that one in the end. In other cities I sometimes lectured in pubs too, some of which had no proper floor, and we had to cope with such things. But in fact, at core, we cannot wish this, and to say we can speak of the Spirit in the same loving way anywhere, in any space at all, would be to misunderstand the nature of our movement. Spirit exists to penetrate, imbue, and configure matter. And this applies too to social and economic life, as I suggested today. Because of all this, we will find it very difficult indeed to say farewell to this hall in a few weeks' time, and to leave these premises that, anthroposophists so kindly helped to furnish and decorate. But a departure and farewell such as this is also something we must regard in the proper way, as a kind of symbol. Over forthcoming decades, people will have to take their leave from much that they hold dear. People do not realize this as yet, and will be surprised when it comes. But those who have really grasped the inmost impulse of spiritual science will recognize that whatever uncertainties approach, one thing will not founder or waver. What we have encompassed in the Spirit, and what we have spiritually resolved to realize. All that we do and we act out of the Spirit, irrespective of how it appears amidst the tumult of the present, will turn out to be for the best. Our departure from this place can therefore stand as a symbol. We must find other premises. But we will carry with us a core and foundation which we know not only to be that of our own deepest inner being, but also the deepest inner being of the world, upon which humanity must build if it wishes to build well. Spiritual science gives us a sure and firm conviction that what we draw from it and pursue by its means cannot be taken from us by anyone, and that it cannot be taken from humanity either, but that it must lead human conditions to a state of greater health. We may well not yet know how we will accomplish many things, but we will accomplish what is needed if we hold fast to the science of the Spirit. Let us grasp fully the significance of Goetheanism for spiritual science, and at the same time recognize, as I recently explained, that the world today scorns and disparages everything associated with Central European culture of the 18th and early 19th century. Nevertheless, if we become fully aware of these things, we can still stand our ground and recognize that whatever may come, this Central European culture will bear fruit in humanity's future progress. Humanity's future depends on it. The adversaries of this Central European culture scorn and disparage it precisely because they do not wish to embrace humanity's true future, preferring to evade it. We can, however, acknowledge this Central European culture to the full, recognizing its spiritual nature and knowing that we can build upon these foundations. And then we can also be sure that even if every devil in Christendom conspires to bring about this culture's downfall, it will not founder. But, equally, that only what is connected with the true Spirit will not go under.